you guys, welcome back to our second week of virtual art with the Partnerships Online Enrichment Program. I'm really excited to see you again. If you weren't with us last week for our drawing project, I'm Mrs. Anderson. I teach art at St. Charles Borromeo. Last week we did a really fun, really cool drawing project. If you want to go back and watch that one, you totally can. But if you just want to skip to this week, that's fine too, because we're going to be painting this week. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to be creating an abstract collage. In order to create something that's abstract, that means that we're not painting anything specific, like we're not painting a sunset or we're not painting a portrait. We're just going to be using shapes and colors and textures to kind of make an interesting composition to look at. Okay, so these are some examples of abstract works of art.
This is a piece of abstract art by an artist named Vasily Kandinsky, who's considered the father of abstract art. This is another piece by an artist named Norman Lewis, who is not just from New York City, but actually from Harlem, where probably a lot of you guys are from. And this is an abstract work of art by an artist named Helen Frankenthaler, who's one of the most famous female abstract artists.
What we're going to be doing today in our first video is we are going to be painting sheets of paper with different colors and textures to make these abstract collages, okay? So our first step is that we're going to make pieces of paper that kind of look like this. So you can see it's just different colors, it's kind of some different patterns and textures on there that you can see that is going to make into a collage. Okay, so if you don't have watercolor paints at home, don't worry, you can still totally do this. If you watch this video, I'm going to show you how to use your watercolors and how to maybe add some different textures using things around your house. And then if you don't have watercolor, I give you some tips and tricks of what to use around your house to make a painting. If you are using things from around your house, keep in mind that you should definitely ask an adult, whether it's mom or dad or grandma, whoever is home with you, before you go and just take some stuff out of the cabinets, because you want to make sure that we're not going to be wasting materials and it's not something that your parents are going to need for later. All right, so let's get started on painting these abstract sheets of paper that in the second video we're going to turn into an abstract collage. Okay, so I'm going to get started with my watercolors. What we need to get started today are a few sheets of paper. I recommend using a thicker paper than maybe just like regular printing paper, because when this gets wet, regular printing paper might actually rip. If you only have printing paper at home, that's totally fine. You can give it a shot, but just remember that if you get it too wet, then the paper will definitely rip. I have this mixed media paper that is nice and thick, and that when I use my watercolor is going to stay nice and sturdy. If you don't have this at home, then they sell it at the dollar store. You can go and get it there. As well as these watercolor palettes. These are something that you probably have seen from art class, right? So if you open them up, then all of these pigments are inside and they're dry. So if I touch them, they don't come off on my finger, and I have to wet them with my brush in order to make the pigment into paint. So I have some paper, I have my watercolor palette, I have a little napkin or a towel to dry off my brush, and I have a little cup of water so that way I can wet my brush to make my paints. All right, so if you don't have these things at home, no worries. I'm going to show you how we're going to do our watercolors here first, and then afterwards I'm going to show you some watercolor hacks and some at-home watercolor tricks that you can use to paint if you don't have something like this at home. All right, so I'm going to put my brush in my water, and I'm gonna start with some blue. So I'm gonna wake up my blue on my palette, and you can see, right, that blue is starting to come off on my brush. And I'm just going to paint some blue watercolor. And I have a lot of pigment on my brush, so I'm gonna spread it around with some water. Today, we are not going to be painting anything in particular. Remember, we're making abstract paintings today. So I'm just going to focus on filling my papers with different colors and textures. And texture is what I'm going to talk about now. But first I'm going to just cover my paper with some different color watercolor paints. Okay, so I painted this big section of my paper. I'm not quite done because I'm gonna go all the way to the edges on this side and all the way to the bottom on this side. But I wanna show you how we're gonna add some texture. So I overlapped some colors and I painted them together. I'm gonna dry off my brush and put it to the side. So there are a few things that we can use to add some texture. That means that it was gonna give the painting a different look than just this flat, up and down kind of paint stroke motion that I started. So what I have is I grabbed some salt. I'm gonna put that over here. And I grabbed some rubbing alcohol and I'm gonna put that over here. And I grabbed some tin foil. And we're gonna use these things to add texture to our painting. So what we can do is I'm gonna try the salt first. I'm gonna make sure that my paper is pretty wet. Maybe I'll add a little bit more paint. Oh yeah, that's nice and dark. All right. Yeah, so that's pretty wet. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sprinkle a little bit of salt, on top of my painting. So you can see how the salt is going to absorb the water, and when it dries, I can dust off my salt, and I'm gonna be left with these kind of like speckled patterns that the salt makes when I leave it on to dry. All right, the next thing I'm gonna use is some of my rubbing alcohol to add some texture. So I added more green paint to the bottom of my paper. I'm gonna add a little more to make it just a little bit darker. All right, and I'm gonna take a Q-tip and I'm just gonna put a little bit of the rubbing alcohol on the Q-tip. And when I tap, let me zoom in for you. When I tap the rubbing alcohol on my watercolor, you can see that the paint kind of expands. Whoops. Right? So I could give it like this dotted pattern. All right, and then I have my salt is kind of drying over here. I have my rubbing alcohol that's kind of filling in with my paint over here. I'm gonna show you the last way that we're gonna add texture today. Okay, so I have my tin foil and you can see it's a little bit wrinkly. That's okay. If I wanna wrinkle it even more, I can. I'm just gonna gently squish it, right? So it gets all these little crinkles in it. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually paint on top of my tin foil right now. Whoops, that's a little too much red on my brush. All right, so I'm gonna put some of this watercolor on top of my tin foil. So I'm gonna put some red on here, put some more purple on too. All right, then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put down my brush and I'm going to print this watercolor on top of my paper. I have to be gentle though because I don't want the foil to rip. And there we go, we have that cool watercolor pattern. And if I want it to spread out a little bit more, I can just take my brush and some water and I can just add some water to the outside so that it kind of blends together a little bit. Right, I could even combine two techniques and I could take my rubbing alcohol and maybe put some rubbing alcohol in this. All right, so now I have one of my pieces of paper that's covered with watercolor paint. It has some different textures on it. So I'm gonna put this to the side and let it dry. Okay, then what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna put it to the side and let it dry, is I'm gonna grab my next sheet of paper and I'm gonna do kind of the same thing, but I'm gonna do some different colors and I'm gonna try maybe combining my texture techniques together. Maybe I'll do salt and rubbing alcohol together. Maybe I'll try and print some more with my tin foil. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna do on my next one. I'm gonna still cover my whole paper with watercolor paint the best that I can, so that we have a nice abstract and colorful sheet of paper. Okay, so now I'm done with my second sheet of abstract paper. Okay, so I painted all my colors in. You can see where I added some salt and it's starting to dissolve in here. You can see some of the patterns that I made using the rubbing alcohol. All right, and then I decided I was gonna print some colors on the bottom with my tin foil, and then I kind of put some more patterns over top. So this is my second sheet of abstract paper. I'm gonna put this one off to the side now so that it can dry. And I'm gonna grab my third piece of paper. And on this third piece of paper, I'm gonna show you guys some at-home watercolor hacks. So if you don't have a paint palette that looks like this, no problem. I'm gonna put mine to the side and I'm gonna show you how else you can use things around your house to make some watercolors. So here is a little trick that you can use at home if you don't have a watercolor paint palette that looks like this. You can kind of make your own. All you need is some washable markers, some foil, and a fresh cup of water and a brush. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my marker and I'm gonna color, oh no, that's okay. And I'm going to color on my foil so that I have some of my green marker ink on my foil, okay? Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my brush and I'm gonna wet it a little bit. And I'm gonna put the water on top of my marker. And you can see it kind of is becoming a liquid. Now my brush looks pretty green. And I can paint right on my paper, just like if it was with my watercolor paint. I can add some more water to this and really make it cover a big amount of space, right? Let's see, let me try another color. Clean my brush off. All right, be careful when you're coloring, right? I just ripped my foil by accident. So make sure you're coloring nice and slow. I'm gonna color some pink. I'm gonna put my brush in my water, get it nice and liquid, and I'm gonna paint my pink right here on my piece of paper. I'm gonna add some more water, right, and cover this big spot up. All right, so if this is nice and wet, just like my other watercolor paint, let's see what happens if we try and add some texture to it. All right, let's see, let me add my salt and see what happens. And you can get the same exact salt effect. Let me put some on my green. Right, so you can see how my salt is now in this watercolor paint that I made out of my markers, and it's gonna make that same kind of like speckly effect after it's dry. All right, so then I just added a big chunk of orange color to my paper because I still want to make sure that I'm covering my entire sheet, but I want to try using my rubbing alcohol with this marker paint thing that I've got going on. So let's see, yes, it does the same effect. And it looks really awesome. So I'm gonna keep going, and I've got one more at-home watercolor hack to show you guys. All right, so my last at-home watercolor hack is a little bit different. It might even be a little bit weird. But if you don't have a paint palette at home, or you don't have markers at home to make your own paint palette, then you can use things from around your house and turn them into paint. So you can use different kind of liquids like tea or coffee, which I have in this glass. You could use different kinds of juice, maybe that you have in your refrigerator that I have right here. So make sure that before you go and grab tea or coffee or juice that you're definitely asking an adult in the house if you can do that first, right? Because you never know if they're gonna drink it. This is actually a tea bag that I used earlier today, and I just put a tiny bit of water in it. so that I could reuse it for some paint. This was some juice that I had in the back of my refrigerator that I knew I was not gonna drink anymore, so I decided to use it for this. If you wanna use coffee, that's gonna be a little bit darker than this tea, right? But maybe you can ask mom or dad to save you some coffee grounds, and that way you can make a little bit of paint and not actually waste any coffee. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dip my brush in my tea, and make sure nobody drinks this after you use it, because that would be silly, right? And it might be kind of light. Some of these different materials might come out a little bit lighter, but maybe you can see mine looks like a really kind of like a yellowish light brown color, right? So I'm gonna paint some of this in stripes on my paper. And I might have to do a couple layers of it because it is pretty light. All right, I'm gonna clean my brush. Let's see what happens when I use the juice. All right, this is pretty light too. All right, so I'm gonna do a few layers of this to try and get some bright colors on my paper. All right, so you can see where I painted in with my homemade watercolor out of tea and juice, right, into this like pattern. Because my colors were so light, I didn't want to do any of my texture techniques to it because I just wanted to see some of the colors drying on my paper first. So I'm gonna go ahead and just finish filling in this last space of my third piece of paper with some of my watercolors. All right, something else to keep in mind is even if you don't want to use the other texture techniques like adding salt or rubbing alcohol or foil to your watercolors, you can just layer your colors like I'm doing right now, right, to give yourself some cool patterns. Even over here, I didn't even layer them, but I have a cool pattern of stripes and dots, right? So that's what I'm just gonna do to finish up my last sheet of abstract painting. All right, so I have my 3 awesome watercolor painted papers. They're still pretty wet, so we're gonna stop at this point for today. In our next video, part 2, we're going to turn these into a cool abstract collage instead of them just being paintings, okay? So I still have one more sheet of paper that has nothing on it that I just set aside, and I'm going to let these dry, and then we will come back for the next few steps, and I can't wait to finish this with you guys.